The Metropolitan Police have taken the extraordinary step of warning two British citizens from Rwanda living in London that they're at risk of being assassinated by the Rwandan government. Legal notices were sent to a former Lib Dem candidate, Rene Mugenzi, and Jonathan Musonera. We've spoken with both men. Now, it's understood that a Rwandan suspected of being part of the plot against the exiles was prevented from entering Britain last week. The embassy here has said the allegations are completely without foundation, but the story raises difficult questions for the British government, who give Rwanda £83 million of aid a year. Richard Watson investigates.
Rwanda has been feted as a model for the new Africa. Economically progressive, its president has courted the West, with some success. Britain will give more than £83 million in aid this year. But this burnished image has been severely tarnished today, with warnings from Scotland Yard that two Rwandan British citizens living right here in the UK should be in fear for their lives. The controversy concerns the government of this man, Paul Kagame, who's taken some credit for unifying the country after a terrible civil war between the Hutu and Tutsi tribes.
This is the Minister for Human Rights.
But Rene Mugenzi doesn't see it this way. He's a British citizen who settled here in 1997. Both he and his wife have stood for local elections, such as their commitment to life in Britain. Rene arranged a meeting last year with Amnesty International to remember this massacre in 1995. He says human rights groups have evidence that this one was perpetrated by forces loyal to President Kagame.
The army of Rwandan Patriotic Army came and then shoot them unarmed civilians, and the UN peacekeeper were looking at this. About 80,000 people died.
So 8,000 people died?
Yes.
On the 12th of May, the Metropolitan Police sent this letter to Rene, warning that the Rwandan government poses an imminent threat to your life.
They told me they have got credible and reliable information that I might be in danger. The government of Rwanda might kill me, and they told me, as I'm aware that they have done it in another country, I should be careful. And also they give me some security advice and some security measure to implement.
The security service MI5 has teams of officers who watch the activities of overseas agents working in Britain. It's highly likely that the tip-off about this alleged plot came from these people working at Thames House. Now, they would have informed the police straight away, but given the political sensitivities of this, they would have also informed the Foreign Office at the highest level. Superficially, modern-day Rwanda appears an unlikely origin for a state-sponsored murder plot. But last week, a suspect Rwandan from Belgium was reportedly stopped at the Eurotunnel terminal in Kent and turned away from Britain. Security sources declined to give details, but told us the threat was credible. Another warning letter was sent to the man on the left, a former Rwandan army officer who fought alongside Paul Kagame in the 1990s. He now lives in London.
I was scared because they told me the Rwandan government, they tried to finish your life, and I was shocked. The Rwandan government, they tried to do that in this country. They say yes, because they gave me the letter, you see the letter, that statement. I asked them why they tried to do this.
Jeanne was also in the army alongside Paul Kagame in the 1990s. She's now an NHS nurse. But it's these former soldiers who apparently rile the president with their desire to rake over old coals with commemorations for the fallen and reconciliations between tribes.
You've got children, they go to school. If you think at some reason, if they don't get me, they will get my child. You come home in the night, you think you're not going to get there. You go to work where you do your level best, but still, somehow, I feel affected.
If you try to go to opposition to challenge him, the reaction of him is just to kill that people who try to be in opposition, or to take them in prison or left the country.
Are you serious about that? Because of course that's quite a serious thing to say, that a president of Rwanda would be capable of killing his opponents overseas. Do you honestly believe that's possible?
Yes, I believe that because I have different examples.
We asked the Rwandan High Commission in London for an interview, but they declined and did not answer our questions. But some senior ex-army officers, even the former chief of defence staff we spoke to in Kigali, says these allegations have the ring of truth.
That's really the pattern of who Kagame is. He's a guy who thinks that if there is a dissenting opinion or a disagreement or an opposition leader, that the fate for such should be to die or to be handed in jail or simply to be thrown into exile.
There's been quite significant progress under the present government. There's been economic improvement, public services have improved, the promotion of women has been something of a trailblazer around the world, so there have been a lot of good things. There's less corruption there than in many of its neighbours, but the trouble is people have been dazzled by that and haven't looked beneath the surface, and beneath the surface there has been very, very strong and worsening repression going on. So we have rivals who have been jailed and in some cases killed. Freedom has been restricted, people talk for being scared to say anything there. There is a climate of fear within the country there.
If proven true, the allegations could, perhaps should, pull the rug from under Rwanda's relations with the West. By making the plot public, MI5 and the police, with the sure knowledge of government, have fired a shot across Rwanda's bowels.
Richard Watson. Well, Malcolm Bruce, who's the chair of the International Development Select Committee, is the House in the House of Commons. It's in Aberdeen for us right now. Malcolm Bruce, I know you had a few problems hearing that report, but thanks for bearing with us. It does sound from this extraordinary story as if the police are taking this quite seriously.
Well, it certainly does, and the actual wording of the statement, which says reliable intelligence, states that the Rwandan government poses an imminent threat to your life. The threat could come in any form, is a pretty formidable statement. Now, the police have not released that statement. Those who have been threatened have, but the police have indicated that they take it seriously. And if that is the case, clearly it's an unacceptable situation which has to be taken seriously.
You're in the position, you'll be in Rwanda, next month? Can you raise this directly with the government?
Well, I think the government, of course, are denying it, as you would expect. But I think the issue that we have to take on board is that, as your report said, Rwanda has made substantial progress in many areas, and indeed after a horrendous massacre, and in a very, very unstable area where security and all kinds of violence is ongoing. Now, that is not an excuse for governments to use violence or threats of violence in return. I think the international community and the British government, who are major players in Rwanda, clearly have to ensure that what they're doing, yes, helps poor people and helps the country deal with its problems, but does stand up for human rights, does stand up...
Well, this is the point. You're talking about progress. I mean, we heard from the commentator there that we've been rather dazzled by this in Rwanda, that there is worsening repression, that rivals are being killed, there's a climate of fear, and we continue to give £83 million a year to this country in aid. Can we justify that?
Well, I think it's a dilemma, and I think it is a mistake we've made in the past, where we have tended to give, if you like, respect to individuals, when what we should be doing is building institutions that rise above any particular individual or political party or focus.
But who is that individual? Is that the president of Rwanda that we saw with David Cameron?
Clearly, the president of Rwanda is in a very powerful position, and he has his critics. I think the dilemma for any organisation delivering aid, the British government included, is how you balance the needs of the poor people and your ability to deliver them, and the need to ensure that you can improve the governance and indeed the government of that country at the same time. And it's a tightrope you have to walk. But if you put it the other way around, if we simply cut our aid and moved away, who would benefit from that? The problem is the poor people of Rwanda certainly wouldn't. But we as a committee will certainly be looking at how we can engage in fragile states. We're putting a lot more money into the whole of that region.
But if you look back, I mean, this is meant to be one of the successes of Africa. We've heard a lot about the Tony Blair Foundation working closely with the government, and yet it must make you feel uneasy.
Of course it does, and success is relative. We're still talking about massive poverty, violence, and threats of violence in the whole of that region. And the British government is actually committing more resources to fragile states because that's where poverty is worse, where the risk of degenerating into further conflict is greatest, and that can aggravate the recovery. That is a highly risky strategy for the government to take. We accept that. And as a committee, we want to look at how they can do it and whether in the process of doing it they can ensure that they make a contribution to improving governance and improving the quality of government. But that is the final test, and we certainly want to evaluate that very objectively, and so don't prejudge it.
Just briefly, because you raised the question of the withdrawing of aid and what would happen there. If I turn that round and say to you, given the scale of cuts that many people in the UK will be facing over the next few years, do you still think £83 million of aid is the right amount of money to be given to a government who we've just heard may be trying to assassinate some of its citizens here?
I'm sorry, I cannot equate the difficulties this country is facing with the hardship, the horrendous situation of people living on $1 and $1.50 a day, whose children have very little chance in many cases of living till their 5th birthday, where mothers die in childbirth because they don't have support. It's a degree of poverty that's incomprehensible to many people in this country, and for us to walk away from it because we have some economic problems is not justified. What we have to do, however, is to ensure the money we spend delivers real results.
Okay.
And in the process, we do what we can to improve the quality of government so that people who don't agree necessarily with the government are not threatened. And if they are being threatened, we've got to make it clear that that is totally unacceptable.
Malcolm Bruce, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. Today, Dominic Strauss-Kahn was released from prison, but the International Monetary Fund is searching for his replacement. It's one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, which uses billions of pounds of British taxpayers' money to bail out bankrupt countries. So who could be in line to save the world? Could it even be our former Prime Minister Gordon Brown? And what are the manoeuvrings behind the scenes? Paul Mason is here. So a real contest. Is Gordon Brown actually in with a chance?
Well, let's remember that the IMF, really, its manifest task right now is to knit together with the World Bank and the G20 countries to make sure that in solving this biggest crisis that we've faced since the war, the odd country doesn't head off on its own and try and escape to the detriment of others. Now, Gordon Brown's been doing that for several years. He's been in that process. And if he wanted to rule himself out, now the contest is live, he could have done today. But this is what he actually said.
Well, the candidate for any job like this should be chosen on merit, and you really want to get the best person for the job. But you know, the issue is wider than that. The issue is how the different institutions, the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization and the United Nations, work together to make the world a better place.
Not sure if he's counted himself in or out, but if it's not him, some of his good friends and indeed arch enemies might be in the running.
The problem we've got is traditionally Europe gets to choose, or it gets to be a European, although as we know the Americans have the lion's share of voting, and together Americans and Europeans can fix it. But look, traditionally the Europeans had it, but these were the Cold War years. The Europeans who were headed the IMF weren't exactly sort of Europe versus America. They were Atlanticist politicians or civil servants. Right now, the problem is Europe is the recipient of the bailouts. We've got Eastern Europe bailed out by Strauss-Kahn's IMF, and now Southern Europe being bailed out partly by the EU. Only tonight, the IMF has doled out 26 billion, or rubber-stamped 26 billion. And unlike Europe, the IMF has the money. It can give it. So, to run it, I think now, over the last 48 hours, Christine Lagarde, the French finance minister, is emerging as the front runner. She's been backed by Angela Merkel, backed by her own politicians, backed by many in Europe. Axel Weber, the man who was too hardline to run the ECB, they're second along there next to Mrs. Lagarde, is apparently in the running. Kemal Dervish of Turkey has ruled himself out tonight. He was somebody people wanted. We've got a guy called Mike Carney from Canada. In the end, it's going to come down to the usual fix. It's not an election as we would know it. It makes the Pope's election look transparent. Because if effectively the Americans and the Brits and the French will get together and say who can do this job of knitting the multilateral institutions together at a time when they have to be inclusive of China, India, Latin America. But the Chinese, Indians and Latin Americans aren't going to get to choose the next head of the IMF.
Briefly, does it matter who's in charge if it all comes down to the balance of power, Paul?
It matters because you get to do